Homeostasis maintains a consistent internal environment as an example of thermoregulation. Building on discoveries about cellular physiology, scientists in the 19th century realized that the body can be viewed as a self-contained environment, carefully regulated so as to provide optimal conditions for cells to live in and grow. This is an elaborate system of behavioral and physiological mechanisms that monitor things like water level, oxygenation, temperature, acidity, and so on. Collectively, these processes are responsible for homeostasis, which is the active regulation of the monitored physical attributes at appropriate levels, resulting in a relatively stable, balanced internal environment. Alterations in the internal environment can have an effect on motivation, or the physiological process that indicates or sustains a particular behavior. In this case, motivation is a drive state that prompts homeostatic behaviors. The mismatch between the internal and the intended state produces a drive to restore balance. This just means when you become dehydrated, you take a drink of water. So the regulation of our internal resources is complicated because staying alive requires us to use up some of them. Our homeostatic mechanisms are challenged by these obligatory losses, which are unavoidable losses of regulated variables as a consequence of life processes. These are things our body requires us to gain and conserve, so heat, water, food, etc. We will use the example of thermoregulation to explain important general concepts in homeostasis, such as negative feedback, redundancy, behavioral homeostasis, and allostatic load. Thermoregulation is the active process of closely regulating body temperature around a set value. So homeostatic systems share several key features. An endotherm is an animal whose body temperature is regulated by internal metabolic processes. This means you make your own heat inside your own body using metabolism and muscular activity. Your muscles suffer to make more heat if need be. An example would be mammals and birds. Endotherms have an advantage over ectotherms because they do not always need to stay near an external heat source. Endotherms also can sustain a greater capacity for oxygen utilization, resulting in higher levels of muscular activity for longer periods of time. An ectotherm is an animal whose body temperature is regulated by the environment. An example would be bees and snakes. So, negative feedback. Homeostatic mechanisms that regulate temperature, body fluids, and metabolism are primarily negative feedback systems. Negative feedback is the property by which some of the output of a system feeds back to reduce the effect of input signals. Deviation from a desired value, called the set point, triggers a compensatory action of the system. Restoring the desired value turns off the response. Usually a set 0 rather than a rigid set point because most systems have a little bit of tolerance built in. So the body temperature for most mammals is usually held within a narrow range, in between 97 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Most animals reduce their temperature during sleep. Sometimes your set zone may be temporarily elevated, producing a fever to help fight off an infection. A fever still has a narrow limit, though, as protein denatures or cooks if it's too hot. Some creatures that cannot avoid sub-freezing temperatures produce antifreeze, consisting of special protein molecules that suppress the formation of ice crystals and prevent damage to the membranes. Redundancy. Our bodies have multiple mechanisms for monitoring our stores, conserving remaining supplies, obtaining new resources, and shedding excesses. Loss of function in one area of the system may be compensated for by another area. This shows the importance of maintaining a stable inner environment. The body has multiple systems for the generation of heat, as well as multiple systems for cooling it if it gets overheated. Also, substantial redundancy in thermoregulatory control systems in the nervous system. The hypothalamus sends and controls body temperature. So this just means different hypothalamic sites control two separate thermoregulatory systems. The one is the preoptic area, or the POA, which responds to cold. This is seen when we shiver and constrict ourselves. And then the lateral hypothalamus is involved with behavioral regulation of temperature, but it has nothing to do with its physiological responses. Behavioral homeostasis. Organisms also use behavioral measures to help them regulate and acquire more food, heat, and water. Both ectotherms and endotherms can employ three kinds of behaviors to regulate temperature. Change in exposure of the body surface, which is seen in huddling or extending limbs. We change our external insulation, which is seen when we use clothes or build nests. And then we change our surroundings, which is when we move into the sun or the shade. Ectotherms generate little heat through metabolism, meaning behavioral methods of thermoregulation are especially important for them. This is seen when iguanas move in and out of the sun, snakes adjust their coils for more or less surface exposure, and so on. Endotherms control their exposure to the sun and to hot or cold surfaces to avoid overtaxing their internal regulatory mechanisms. This is seen when we jump into a swimming pool on a hot day. So, the basic mammalian thermoregulatory system. The receptors are the skin, body core, and hypothalamus/POA. These transmit info to three neural regions. The three neural regions are the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the hypothalamus/POA. So if body temperature moves outside the set zone, each of these neural regions can initiate physiological and behavioral responses to return to the set zone. The effectors are behavioral, an example would be shivering, and autonomic responses, an example of that would be sweating. So allostasis is the coordinated set of behavioral and physiological changes to maintain homeostasis. The wear and tear of daily life is known as the allostatic load. In relation to allostasis, prior experience with challenges allows us to make predictions and activate a coordinated set of responses in order to ward off serious homeostatic deviations. Allostatic adjustments are a normal part of life, but being chronically stressed increases your allostatic load, putting you at a greater risk of pathology. Fluid regulation. The water that you drink is carefully measured and partitioned by the brain. An exact balance of fluids and dissolved salts bathes the cells of the body and enables them to function. Composition of body fluids reflects the evolutionary origins of life on Earth. Most organisms have evolved homeostatic mechanisms that ensure that the composition of the body fluids closely resemble diluted seawater. We have an evolutionary history stemming from unicellular ocean inhabitants. Describe water balance by contrasting the inside versus the outside of our cells. Most of our water is contained within our cells, known as the intracellular compartment. Fluid outside of our cells is known as the extracellular compartment. This is divided between the extracellular compartment is divided between the interstitial fluid, or the fluid between cells, and blood plasma, or the protein-rich fluid that carries red and white blood cells. Water is constantly moving in and out of these compartments via aquaporins. These are channels spanning the cell membrane specialized for conducting water molecules in or out of cell. A single aquaporin channel can selectively conduct about 3 billion molecules of water per second. Diffusion is the spontaneous spread of molecules of one substance among molecules of another substance until a uniform concentration is achieved. This is seen when a solvent dissolves in water. Osmosis is the passive movement of water molecules from one place to another until a uniform concentration is achieved. This is seen when water moves to where it is less concentrated. Osmotic pressure is the physical force that pushes or pulls water across the membrane. Osmolality is the concentration of solute in a solution. Normally, the concentration of salt is about 0.09% in the extracellular fluid of mammals. This expresses a weight-to-volume ratio. And this solution is a physiological saline and is isotonic, meaning the concentration of salt is the same as that found in the interstitial fluid and blood plasma, which again is about 0.09%. A solution with more salt than 0.09% is hypertonic, while a solution with less salt than 0.09% is hypotonic. Water moves through... Ooh, sorry, I lost my page. Okay, water moves to produce uniform saltiness. Cells will lose water if placed in a saltier solution and gain water in a less salty solution. If excessive, this movement can damage or kill the cell. To prevent this damage, the extracellular fluid serves as a buffer, a reserve isotonic fluid that provides and accepts water molecules so that cells can maintain proper internal conditions. We experience constant obligatory losses of salt in water. And we have two internal cues that trigger thirst. The extracellular fluid is an indicator of conditions in the intracellular compartment. The nervous system carefully monitors extracellular fluid to see if we should seek water. Two states signal if we need more water. One is high extracellular concentration of solute, which results in osmotic thirst, and then a low extracellular volume due to the loss of body fluids, which triggers hypovolemic thirst. Osmotic thirst is triggered by increased saltiness of the extracellular fluid. Most of the time, we experience thirst due to the obligatory loss of water. This is seen when physiological processes in which we lose more water than salt, so respiration, perspiration, urination, and so on. In this case, the volume of the extracellular fluid is decreased and the solute concentration of the extracellular fluid increases. Water is pulled out of the cells through osmosis due to the increased extracellular saltiness. Extracellular fluid can become more salty by ingesting salty foods, and again, water is drawn out of the cells through osmosis. Osmotic thirst is independent of extracellular volume, being triggered by an increase in the solute concentration of the extracellular fluid. This causes us to seek water in order to return the extracellular fluid to an isotonic state, and to protect the intracellular compartment from being dangerously depleted of water. Osmosensory neurons are specialized neurons that measure the movement of water into and out of cells. These have some unusual features that help them detect the concentration of extracellular fluid. They're stretchy, so they swell or shrink as the concentration of extracellular fluid changes. Stretching and shrinking opens and closes special mechanically gated ion channels that stud the membrane, causing changes in cell membrane potentials that track the changes in extracellular concentration. The info is then carried to other parts of the brain, resulting in thirst and homeostatic responses to conserve water. And that is it.